discussion entitled Ukraine's Path to NATO, Current Challenges, Canada's Support, and Path to Reconstruction. My name is Lisa Shimko, and as Director of the NATO Association of Canada, it is my pleasure to give short opening remarks about the mission of our charitable non-governmental organization. The roots of the NATO Association of Canada go back to 1966, when the Atlantic Council of Canada was created to promote knowledge and understanding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And although Canadians may not have given a great deal of thought to the importance of NATO in decades past, today, the largest war in Europe since World War II, launched by Russia against Ukraine, has refocused public attention on NATO's role and how the alliance must evolve if we are to defend democracy, defeat unjustified aggression, and protect transatlantic security more effectively. NATO's cornerstone principle of collective defense, as we can all see, is being tested daily by an asymmetrical war waged by Russia and its Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean authoritarian allies. That's why today's discussion on Ukraine's path to NATO is so valuable, as it provides a forum for Canadians to learn more about Ukraine's contribution to NATO security and to discuss Canada's role in this strategic partnership. And yes, I am one of those Canadians who is a strong proponent of NATO membership for Ukraine, a nation which is de facto defending the free world from Russian expansionism. I just wanted to quickly say that I know that today's discussion is going to be available on the YouTube channel of the NATO Association of Canada. So I encourage our audience members to follow us on the various social media platforms. That includes Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and X, especially because the NATO Association of Canada will soon have some exciting announcements coming for this spring, which I'm sure Robert will be actively promoting. Today, we are delighted and honored to welcome our distinguished guest, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, Her Excellency Yuliya Kovaliv, someone who I would say is one of the most active European diplomats serving in Canada. In addition to focusing on defense and security issues, Ambassador Kovaliv has been working tirelessly to encourage Canadian businesses to help rebuild Ukraine's infrastructure and digital and IT sectors after the war ends. And I'm sure that the ambassador will tell us more about these undertakings in her remarks. So now I'd like to turn the microphone over to three members of our NATO Association team who will be serving as moderators for today's discussion: Bogdana Torbina, Olena Kryzhenivska, and Anastasia Dyachenko.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our diplomatic speaker series, exploring the partnership and cooperation with NATO allies and global partners in navigating today's complex and challenging security environment. My name is Bogdana Torbina, and I'm Chief of Staff of the NATO Association of Canada.
My name is Olena Kryzhenivska, and I'm the Senior Editor of the NATO Association.
And my name is Anastasia Dyachenko, and I am the NAOC Engagement Coordinator.
We are honored to be joined today by Her Excellency Yuliya Kovaliv, the Ambassador of Ukraine to Canada. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, before we get into the questions, I would like to briefly introduce Ambassador's bio. Yuliya Kovaliv was appointed to as Ukraine's ambassador to Canada and arrived to Ottawa on March 29, 2022. Prior to joining the embassy, Ambassador Kovaliv held the position of the Deputy Head of Office of the President of Ukraine in charge of economic policy development and IFIs coordination. She also served as the Deputy Chair of the Supervisory Board of national state-owned oil and gas company Naftogaz of Ukraine from 2019 to 2021. The Deputy Secretary of the National Investment Council of Ukraine under the President of Ukraine and the member of the National Reform Council. In 2017 to 2019, Ambassador Kovaliv served as the head of the Office of the National Investment Council of Ukraine under the President of Ukraine advisory platform, which included global business leaders and IFIs, where she was in charge of investment promotion, policy dialogue, and FDI attraction. Ambassador, we invite you to begin with some opening remarks before we begin with the questions.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, the NATO Association Canada, for hosting this event and for leading the important discussion on NATO as today's the strongest defense and deterrence alliance in the world. And actually, as we see since the start of the full-scale Russian invasion, and it's what also stated between many of the NATO members, that actually NATO today is much stronger than it was. And one of the strengths of the NATO is also their actions and their decisive actions of the countries which are the NATO members to support Ukraine with our fight for our freedom, for our sovereignty. But also it's the fight for NATO security, because today actually the battlefield which is in Ukraine is actually the fight also to protect the eastern flank of NATO. And we see that the tectonic change in the approach towards security and defense across the globe, and especially when it comes to the NATO members. Today, we see that NATO expanded, so we have two more countries who joined NATO as an alliance recently, and we as Ukraine are looking forward also to join this path, what Sweden, what Finland did just recently, and becoming the NATO member in a short period of time in the coming time. And today, it's more about the political decision of the NATO members. Because if we look on the cooperation between Ukraine and NATO, the first and the most from Ukrainian side is that Ukraine's desire to NATO is hugely supported by Ukrainians. So majority of Ukrainian population, Ukrainian people supports Ukraine joining NATO. It's also becoming a part of our constitution. The aspiration of Ukraine to become the EU member and the member of NATO is the important milestone which is already a part of the constitution of Ukraine. And as you remember back in 2022, when the full-scale Russian invasion started, that was the application sent by the president of Ukraine, by the speaker of the parliament and prime minister to Ukraine to become the EU member and the NATO member, which we all understand why it is so important for Ukraine. Because if we look back to the history of independent Ukraine, Russia has back then their imperial and I would say even colonial aspirations to keep the countries which are their neighbors under Russian geopolitical control, under Russian influence. And for decades, we in Ukraine saw different types of these Russian activities, whether Russia was using energy as a weapon, as a political bargain to many of Ukrainian politicians and political parties to try to not allow Ukraine to move towards Europe, in order to not allow Ukraine to move towards the NATO membership. We also saw a huge disinformation and many other hybrid warfares that Russia has been conducting for the decades. And when Russia started the war, and actually it started back in 2014, it started with occupation of Crimea, it started with the illegal occupation of the Ukraine's territory of the Donetsk and Luhansk region. Even at that time, Ukraine was already very loudly saying and explaining to all of the partners that the reaction, which is like a deep concern on condemnation, it's not something what Russia treats seriously. And we already were saying to our partners that Russia will not stop there. And the only thing that Russia understands is the strengths. And the strengths of Ukraine as the member of the NATO in the future is as much essential as it was in the past, because this is the only way that could guarantee the post-war security for Ukraine. Because Russia will continue to be geographically our neighbor, but only the Ukraine joining the NATO as a strong deterrence alliance will prevent Russia from the further escalations, from the further aggressions. We also can look in the reality from our Baltic neighbors and the Eastern European neighbors, because all of them are the NATO member, and the NATO members, they feel this. I would not say that they feel security, but this is something what deter Russia from the further escalations in the other different fronts. So this is now one of the key component for long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, which is at the same time an important part for the post-war recovery from the country. And we will probably talk a bit today as well on the future recovery and the rebuilding of Ukraine, for which security and the security guarantees that Ukraine will have will be an important factor and enabler for the private capital to support Ukraine's rebuilding and reconstruction. We also see now, as we are talking, the very important shift in defense spendings and in the acknowledgement of many years that where many of the countries were reluctant towards spending and investing more funding, more efforts in defense, in security. And as we see the dynamics of how the countries are implementing the NATO commitment about the 2% spendings on defense, we see a dramatic shift for the last 3 years of how the countries are investing. We also hear very well the discussion that is now going on about whether 2% is enough, because many countries who are the NATO members already are warning and raising the issue that 2% is far not enough. Because on the one side, all the defense capabilities and the defense sector itself was not prepared for that kind of the war which Ukraine is fighting. This is the biggest conventional war in the European continent since the Second World War. And it took time for many of our European countries to realize the scale of that challenge. We see more and more voices, especially with the European members who are NATO members, more warnings that they need to be prepared within the next 4 or 5 years to potentially challenge the full-scale aggression. And that is a very alarming thing. And I think, we just are now on that point of time where it's not only about the warnings, it's not only about the risks, but it also requires the joint decisive actions. And Ukraine is now fighting actually to protect the eastern flank of NATO. So today this fight is on Ukrainian land. And today Ukrainian people, Ukrainian soldiers are dying to protect the eastern flank of NATO and to protect NATO as an alliance.
Thank you for your opening remarks, Ambassador. Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1991 and Partnership for Peace in 1994. In 2009, NATO leadership reaffirmed the decision that Ukraine will become a member of NATO following the 2008 Bucharest summit. Ukraine applied for NATO membership in September of 2022 following Russia's full-scale invasion. How have Ukraine-NATO cooperation and priorities evolved over the past 3 decades, especially following Russia's invasion? Can you please explain to our audience Ukraine's current stage of NATO membership negotiations and the challenges ahead?
Thank you. And you rightly mentioned that the history of Ukraine's cooperation with NATO starts probably since the very first days of Ukraine becoming the independent state. There is also one of the things that we also need to remember while talking about the deterrence, because the NATO as alliance is about the deterrence of any of the aggressions. And actually, before 1996, Ukraine had this deterrent package. So back then, Ukraine possessed one of the third biggest in the world stock of nuclear weapons. And Ukraine made the decision to get away of these weapons. But what we got in reality, we got the assurance from the 4 countries. One of them were Russia, who guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and Ukraine's security. And what we face now is the 3rd year of the full-scale war, illegal and unprovoked Russian aggression. So it also gives us a sense that the assurances does not work. And Russia bluntly breached them, illegally occupying Crimea, illegally occupying eastern regions in Donetsk and Luhansk region back in 2014. But especially with the start of the full-scale invasion, that is, every possible international law that, including the UN Charter, which recognizes and protects the country in terms of their territorial integrity, in terms of their sovereignty. Russia is also the member of the Security Council, challenged that all. And I would say, and I think it's very right to say, it challenged the rule-based order that was built post Second World War. And when we are today engaging with many countries far beyond the NATO members, the countries in Latin America, the countries in the Middle East, and many of them, which we call the Global South, their strong support of Ukraine is in its core based on the understanding that in the world, both the small countries in terms of their territory and the big ones, military powers, and not so strong in their military, both economically developed countries and the countries who are developing, they can work on their own domestic policies, they can engage internationally, but based on this international rules-based order. What Russia did, it just tried to, by force, withdraw the borders of a sovereign country. And it's something which is unacceptable for majority countries of the world. Coming back to the NATO, as I mentioned, that the path of Ukraine to NATO started back in 1991 with a lot of different engagements, including a very important milestone from Ukraine, which is now, as I've said, the part of Ukraine's aspiration to NATO is a part of our constitution. But also, we are talking about very practical steps. And these practical steps, especially since the start of the full-scale invasion, went to very specific cooperation with NATO. There are several of the important milestones and the institutions which are supporting this cooperation. It is the NATO-Ukraine Council, which serves the platform for the consultation and the cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, which is regularly meeting, both discussing the current challenges on the front line, but also discussing many institutional challenges. We also, NATO established the comprehensive assistance package to Ukraine, where Canada also contributed to that package, which helps us on institutional level. We also have, based on the Washington Summit, created the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, which is the platform that serves as a coordination for the NATO member countries within their support, especially the military support, the training support to Ukraine. But also the discussion, how it started back from 2022, when Ukraine was starting to ask NATO about NATO standard weapons. And the first answers back at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we heard that Ukrainian soldiers cannot use it, they can't train it, it will take a lot of time. We are now at the level when Ukraine actually have the most, I think the biggest variety of all of the different types of the NATO weapons that our army use. Another important thing that today Ukrainian army is well trained within the NATO standards. And I would like here to stress the importance of the Unifier program, which was launched by Canadian government. It was the first training program based to train Ukrainian men and women in the uniform according to the NATO standards, launched back in 2015 after the illegal occupation of Crimea and eastern parts of Donetsk and Luhansk region. And so that was already an important investment in building the capability of Ukrainian forces, which is in line with the NATO standards. When the full-scale invasion started, the program Unifier became a part of the joint program Interflex with UK, which cover now different types of training, including engineering, including tactical medicine, including demining, and including just the basic training for Ukrainian troops. And we have many countries who joined this coalition of training. Canada also joined the coalition of training the pilots for the fighter jets. So we went a very deep and a very comprehensive way in training Ukrainian soldiers within the NATO standards. And indeed, Ukraine's army today is one of the strongest army in comparison to many NATO countries, because they have a real experience on the battlefield. And on the battlefield where the tactics of the warfare is changing, it's not only the conventional war with artillery, with the armored vehicles, tanks. It's also the war of technology. It's the war which warfare, which both sides are using the modern UAVs, electronic warfare, where the artificial intelligence and technologies which are based on AI are getting more and more impact on the battlefield. So it's also today Ukraine is building one of the strongest defense sector and one of the most innovative one, because it takes only a few weeks from the new type of UAVs or technology to be developed and tested on a real front and the real battlefield. So in terms of the capability, we are very close and I would say in line with the NATO standards. When it comes also practically to the weapons, we are using almost all of the types available of the NATO standard weapons in Ukraine with the different types. And I would say that many of the countries are now working with us on even getting the feedback on the different types of weapons that were supplied to Ukraine and are actually being used and tested on the front line, which gives also an important understanding how they can be used in the real battlefield. So this is the one important thing in terms of the physical capabilities. In terms of the institutional challenges, while fighting the war, Ukraine continued to implement the reforms. And the key focus of the reform agenda in Ukraine is to implement the measures and the specific changes to both Ukrainian legislation and institutions to be in line with EU regulation as on the way to EU membership and the same way to NATO. So today, like our defense sector or Ministry of Defense and the other agencies involved, they are not only like putting their 100% efforts for the fighting the war, they are also continue to provide the reforms that are important for Ukraine to become a NATO member. And I think today, in terms of Ukraine-NATO dialogue, it is going on a different platforms. We are the member of different groups, whether it's like just finished the assessment of the NATO standard procurement. We are actively engaged with NATO in cyberspace and in technology, and I think there is no probably room where Ukraine is not actively engaged today with different types of discussions with NATO and with NATO countries. But still there is one remaining thing for Ukraine to become a NATO member. It's the political will for NATO countries to provide this invitation. And we believe that this is the crucially important as a prerequisite for the long-term security in Ukraine.
Thank you for that answer, Ambassador. And our next question is about Canada-Ukraine cooperation, something that you have already touched upon briefly, and the role of Ukrainian diaspora in this cooperation. So as we know, Canada is home to a large Ukrainian diaspora of over 1.4 million people, making it country's 11th largest diaspora community. How would you assess the impact of the Ukrainian diaspora on Canadian political landscape, and particularly in response to the Russian invasion?
Thank you. Indeed, this is the very unique Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. It has been the first Ukrainians arrived in Canada 130 years ago, and since that time, Ukrainians became an important part of Canadian people, of Canadian society. And you know that they've played many important roles in building Canada, in contributing to Canada. There are many of the very famous Ukrainian Canadians who contributed to in the different sectors, whether it's the government, and we all remember the Governor General of Ukrainian descendant, who was the head of the state Canada. We had the very people who were working as the members of the parliament, as the famous sportsmen, the judges, the people on the expert level, on the university level, and just a huge contribution from Ukrainian community to developing the prairies historically is something that I think helped to shape these provinces as they are now. And of course, it's very unique because the role and the voice of Ukrainian community in Canada was very important in decades ago. And even before Ukraine became an independent state, it was a very strong and vocal voice of Ukrainian community in Canada, who were one of the strongest and most organized and most vocal among the Ukrainian communities around the world, who supported and who advocated for Ukraine's independence. And I think there is a big portion of that advocacy and that strong voice that Canada became one of the first country to recognize Ukraine's independence in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, when the full-scale invasion started, it was the full shock to many people around the world, and of course to Ukrainian community, because it's not only about the country, it's also each and every Ukrainian Canadian has the strong ties to Ukraine. they have their families, they have their friends in Ukraine. And of course, I think, their voice is very important as the voice of understanding deep what is in stake. And at stake, it's not only the important thing that the survival of Ukraine as the independent, sovereign, democratic state. But I think we Ukrainians and also Ukrainian Canadians here understand that at stake is also a bigger thing. The bigger thing is whether the rule-based international order prevail, or we will be getting into the world which is led by dictatorship of authoritarian regimes like Russia, like North Korea, like Iran. And this is the existential thing as we see the world now. Also, I think the very important role of Ukrainian community was also explaining and advocating for the very specific needs for Ukraine. And I'm really grateful for the role they played. And the third thing is the amazing thing what the people around the world and I as ambassador to Canada saw was the strong voice of community here. It's a huge appeal on the humanitarian side. I would assume that we're talking more than $100 million and more of the humanitarian support that was sent and was supported by Ukrainian community in Canada to help Ukraine, to help Ukrainians, and also to help many of those Ukrainians who were fleeing the war and found the temporary shelter here in Canada. And the uniqueness of Ukrainian community in Canada, and it's really the admiration of the efforts of many people and through generations, is also that Ukrainian community in Canada strongly preserve Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian traditions, Ukrainian studies in universities. And it also means a lot for that keeping Ukrainian identity and keeping this Ukrainian courage, what is, I think, in a DNA of every Ukrainian, both in Ukraine and here in Canada. So their role, their advocacy is very important. And I think especially now as we will mark the third year of the start of the full-scale invasion, and to keep the people informed what is happening in Ukraine is also where Ukrainian community continues to play a very important role.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your answer. So the next question we have is, NATO member countries are leading supporters of Ukraine in its fight against Russian invaders, with the United States playing a key role. In your opinion, how might the outcome of the recent US election affect the situation?
Thank you. It is a united course for us as Ukraine fighting, but also for our partners who are supporting us. I think, we are facing now the reality that we need to do more, and we need all together to do more. Why I'm talking about that? Because if you see the recent, like within the last 6 months, developments on the front line and what's happening in Russia, we need to understand that first, today we are fighting as Ukraine not only with Russian troops. Today there are North Korean troops on the ground, and actually Ukraine is fighting with 2 nuclear powers at one time, with our own people, with our own soldiers who are withstanding Russia, which was supposed to be which was perceived before 2022 as the second biggest army in the world. On the one side, Russia has already strategically failed, because with the intentions of Russians back in 2022 to get control over Kyiv and over the whole country within 2 weeks, We are today almost 3 years into the full-scale war, and Russia failed with that goal. And on the other side, we also need to acknowledge that Russia is putting more and more their economy on the war footprints. Their defense spendings are increasing from year to year. This year, they are increasing up to 25% of their defense spendings. And if we look on our European partners, almost none of them are investing in such a scale into the defense. Russia continued to increase the production of different types of the weapons, of the missiles, of the drones, with building strong cooperation with Iran. And you all probably saw the attacks of Iranian Shahed drones over Ukrainian cities and over Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Their engagement with North Korea is expanding, and that is also something that really raises the concerns of many countries in the Indo-Pacific region, because it's where North Korean troops are getting real experience in the battlefield, which many of the NATO members never had in the decades ahead. So the North Korean engagement together with Russian soldiers is increasing North Koreans' army capabilities, which is very disturbing especially for the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, that's need to be more done. More done not only on the side of the funding, because it's not enough to commit the funding. There need to be capabilities. And here where in many of the European capitals and here in Canada and across all the NATO members, the dialogue between the defense industry need to be more stronger. Because if we see the lead time of production of the weapons, of some of the shortages of specific spare parts or technologies, it takes years. As the first call back in 2022, we are very grateful that many of our partners were contributing to us the weapons, whether it was tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, or artillery shells, or air defense, which were on their stock. But back in mid of 2022, we start to warning our partners that it's not enough. The stock will go down very quick. And the start of the cooperation with the defense sector, with the industry, building the long-term plans with them on the significant increase of the defense production, on significant increase on the innovation in the defense side. As we see, it's now also the war of drones, the war of where AI has been used. It's also the big challenge. We see it's happening in many countries, and as I mentioned before today, there are more and more voices among the NATO members understanding that 2% is not enough. Some of them are talking about 5% of the defense spendings, and it's not it's not something that have been a discussion 5 years ago. But this is the real threat, and if we see those countries who are closer to the front lines, who are closer to the Russian borders, most of them are already for this year, like, for example, Lithuania, like, for example, Estonia, they are talking about 5% on defense. And it is also important on for the US, which are the big contributor to the strengths of NATO, to understand that the other NATO members are contributing. And we see this shift and we see this dynamics for many of the NATO members in Europe, but more need to be done. And this is now a very, I think, serious moment where the not only the declarations, but the actions to increase these defense spendings and to facilitate them are of the great importance, not only for us as the country who is fighting the war, but also for the strength of the NATO alliance. On our side, I would say on the Ukrainian side, we are hugely investing into our own defense capabilities. Last year, nobody believed, but we, as promised, built over 1 million of drones of different types. Today, Ukraine defense sector is rapidly growing because we understand that in Ukraine, when we can produce a lot of types of weapons quicker and cheaper, and they are much quicker delivered to the front line. We are building also the partnerships with the leading world defense companies for allocating the production in Ukraine. We are also grateful for the new initiative that the Danish government launched, is so-called the Danish model, where our partners are helping Ukraine with the military support by procuring the types of weapons that we produce in Ukraine. Because we have capability of production in defense sector, which several times exceeds the financial ability which our budget is able to procure from the industry. And I'm also grateful for the recent announcement of Canadian government to support Ukraine through this Danish model by the production of UAVs. And specifically for UAVs, we see them as one of the very interesting and very important, sector of cooperation in defense sector between Canada and Ukraine. We have a lot to build together. Canada has one of the best technologies in the world when it comes to specific navigation, optics, communication, and the other technologies. We have the real experience on the battlefield, including with the quite strong Russian electronic warfare, which is the win-win where we can build together the joint production, and that can be used later also in Canada. Because one important thing that many Canadians need to, I think, remind themselves that Russia is not only, Russia is Canadian neighbor through Arctics. And today, Arctics is more and more becoming the region of potential geopolitical tensions. And there is this urgency in increasing both the defense spendings and the capabilities to be able to contribute to NATO collective security.
Ambassador, I had a follow-up question with regards to a U.S. policy that you touched upon, and you focused on the military spending question. We've noticed a little bit of a shift in the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. administration in terms of how they see the resolution of the war. Initially, the incoming president said the problem would be resolved within days. Then it shifted to 100 days. And now they've thrown off the idea of increased tariffs, as Trump said, or sanctions. I'm wondering what you have heard on your side in terms of the energy sector, because that's your expertise. The Biden administration was hesitant to allow Ukraine to target a Russian energy infrastructure, but we've shown that that's a very effective policy. Now we've heard Trump talking about possibly getting the Saudis to lower the price of oil so that this affects the Russian economy. How have you heard anything about real exploration of such policy that would intensify economic pressure on Russia?
I can probably address why this file is important and why the energy and reducing Russian ability to get the revenues from the energy sector is a crucial one. because Russia's main revenues from Russian economy is through export of oil and gas. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the sanctions that they were imposed, they were sometimes too late, too small. And we saw and what Russia was trying to do, and they unfortunately successfully built that many ways of circumvent the sanctions. They are doing it in the defense sector. We see many of the technologies as spare parts made by Western companies, which we still find in the debris of Russian missiles, Russian drones. But in the same time, Russia invested over $10 billion in building the shadow oil tankers fleet to be able to continue to export Russian oil and Russian LNG gas. This is the main source of revenue to Russian war machine. And the strong sanctions, and we saw only the really kind of a strong sanctions coming, which were like at the end of 2022 and the beginning of this year, specifically like strongly hitting the Russian oil and gas sector, which were coming from US. But we need to understand that this is the constant work. Russia, the end thing, which is the important one, is to decrease the ability of Russia to get these energy revenues. And of course, there was the price cap imposed, but it didn't get the result that it was expected. Russia continued to export oil and gas, and now with the new administration messaging about the importance of depriving Russia from this revenues, it's really crucial one. And now we see the decisive actions of UK government, who sanctions the shadow Russian tanker fleet. We see the sanctions that were imposed by the previous administration on US administration on the Russian oil and gas sector. We will see the results of the sanctions in coming months. We see this shift is coming. We see Gazprom, which was once the big cash pocket for Putin and his regime, is now the 3 years in a row loss-making company. But still, there are a lot of loopholes. It's need to be a constant work and coordination between G7 and broader European partners on the sanctions. Because without these revenues, it will be much harder for Putin to continue to wage the war, to continue to support its economy. Because Putin does not, he understand, and he is more vulnerable than many people would think. He needs to keep his population fed. He needs to continue to provide the social services, so he needs the money for that. Their sovereign reserves already depleted more than 50%. There is not so much room for Putin to continue further, unless he will continue to get these revenues from export of oil and gas. So this is one of the important economic measure that will deprive Putin from his further ability to wage the war, but it's not enough. The military support needs to come to Ukraine. So these are the two parallel important tracks that need to be perceived.
Thank you so much for your inputs and insights, Ambassador. With that, we bring our moderated discussion to a close. We will now be opening the floor to questions from our live audience. And the first question from the discussion is, what do you believe is the hardest part for Ukraine to be fully integrated into NATO, despite the tremendous sacrifices, millions displaced, cities destroyed, and a nation tested to its limits? How can Ukraine overcome the obstacles that remain?
If we are talking about the NATO membership, today it's the political decision to provide the invitation to Ukraine. And I can give you the example why I think that, because if we look parallel on Ukraine's track to EU membership, we got the invitation. Today, Ukraine officially have the status of being the candidate to EU membership. We continue to do our homework, including the reforms and the changes into the legislation to be aligned with the EU regulation. We expect this year to open the chapters for negotiations with the EU. And this is, I would say, the fast track on our side of committing our obligations. With regards to NATO, today it's really the political will to provide Ukraine and this political decision to provide Ukraine the invitation. And we believe also today Ukraine, being a NATO member, will significantly increase the capabilities of NATO. Because today Ukrainian army is one of the strongest, with the real combat experience, with the real experience of technologies. And as today, Russia is named to be the biggest challenge and the biggest adversary to NATO, we know how to deal with this. We know it practical. We have the strong army that can contribute to NATO and can contribute to NATO operations. And I think, we will, after the end of the war, as we've talked today about many countries helping Ukraine to train our troops, I think, after the war, Ukraine will be providing a lot of training and other advisory services to many countries, NATO members, on building their defense sector, building their defense capabilities, including building their forces.
Thank you. The next question we have is, one of the main concerns of Ukraine's potential private sector investors is the lack of security guarantees amidst ongoing active combat. Recently, Trump's team has stated that ending Russia's war would involve delaying Kyiv's NATO membership for at least 20 years in exchange for continued arms supplies. What implications does Ukraine's NATO membership have not only on its security, but also economy and reconstruction? Can you please also talk about opportunities for Canada's involvement in reconstruction, both public and private?
Look, the security guarantees for Ukraine, and as you mentioned, NATO membership is the key to the security guarantees, is the crucial point for the country, for our existence, and for the post-war rebuilding, and for security of Europe. Because we all understand that without the real security guarantees, Putin will use this time for a pause, for rebuilding its army, for rebuilding its economy, and he will go further. We saw it back in 2014, and without the proper security guarantees, that is the Russian aggression will continue. And I think it's even with Putin's regime or somebody else's regime, I think there's deep in Russians' mind this imperialism concept. And if you saw like the history, how Russia was developing, first of all, they were never able to build the strongest democratic institutions inside the country. And they were always fighting somewhere else. That was the source, or internally with their own people, or oppressing their own people, or putting their people and their opposition to jail, or killing their own opposition, whether on Russian territory or in the other countries. We saw it. This is the core of Russian regime. And this is unfortunately, with their disinformation campaigns, with their control of the media. This is unfortunately the view, and we need to also realize it. This is the view of majority of Russian people. So where geographically we will face Russia as the neighbor. So the question is how we can guarantee that this war won't happen again. And the most straightforward and the most solid guarantees for that, it's Ukraine membership of NATO. And on the other angle, which is also important to realize, is that today the losses of Ukraine's economy exceeds $400 billion. This is like starting from the energy sector, which is specifically and targetedly bombarded by Russians. This is the broader infrastructure, houses, hospitals. So there is no red lines where Russia is not, launching their missile drone attacks. There is over 7 million of Ukrainians now living abroad who want to come back. But the thing is how they want to come back to secure Ukraine. So the core of post-war Ukraine recovery is the understanding of the long-term security for Ukraine. And, as I've said, the most straightforward of this security is the NATO membership. The same with regard to the private sector. And private sector would be and should be, and we want the private sector, and especially the companies from the countries who were our big supporters, like Canada. We want Canadian companies to export their technologies, to export their equipment, to come to Ukraine and participate with their knowledge, with their expertise, with their people, with their equipment in Ukraine's rebuilding. We are talking about kind of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, the plan that will also be able to engage with the private capital. But what is the first question of many of these companies and this capital? How secure Ukraine is, and what are the instruments that will deter Russian aggression for the future? So this is something what is an enabler to rebuild and help support Ukraine's post-war recovery and rebuilding, whether it's on the business level, whether it's on the people's level. And I would tell you even like on the personal level, what Ukrainians think about it. And one of the soldier, a friend of mine who is now fighting on the front line, and I've talked just recently with him and asked him like, how is he? He said like, it's hard. It's not easy. Yes, people are tired. It's the cold winter, it's trenches, but we are ready to sacrifice for our children not to fight another war. And he is the father of a 10-year-old son. So this is the sense of what we as Ukrainians understand, that thousands of lives have been already lost, that a lot of people, both on the front line, civilians, a lot of families who lost their ones. And if there won't be the straightforward and strong security guarantees post-war, it's also for Ukraine's society, it is something unacceptable because of those losses, because of those hardship and those pains and those war crimes that Russian soldiers have committed and Russian regime have committed in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Looks like that is all we have time for. We would like to convey our sincerest thanks to you for agreeing to have this conversation today with us. Дякуємо вам. And with that, I would like to pass it on to our President and CEO, Robert Baines, for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Elena. Ambassador, what a great discussion. I think I've mentioned this several times. The NATO Association of Canada is really pushing in 2025 to make sure that all Canadians realize that Ukraine's fight is our fight. The entire rules-based international order is based on the idea of the United Nations, the idea that borders must not be changeable by force. That is the whole thing that we fought so hard for in both the First and Second World War, and the institutions that were built up after it, is to make sure that this was no longer seen as a legitimate use of politics or force, and to make sure that the rules-based international order holds that as sacred. We cannot allow this norm to be demolished in this way, and it just has to be as shocking now as it was back in 2022. So we will continue to fight for this and make sure Canadians see this. It is incumbent upon all of us as citizens to make sure that we talk about this and that we keep this on our radar constantly. That as much as we have to deal and are concerned with our everyday lives, our families, what's going on at work, we also have to pay attention about what's going on around the world, and specifically through NATO and the rest of the rules-based international order, to maintain the world that we want, that we fought so hard for, but also that we've grown to expect over the past decades. The norms that we have are essential. So with everything that's going on globally, I think Canadians must wake up and to support Ukraine and so many other issues of our defense and security and our alliances, multilateralism more generally. Ambassador, an absolute pleasure to have you, and we look forward to further discussions. Thank you so much, Elena, Anastasia, and Bogdana, as well as Lisa Shimko. Thank you so much for guiding us through this discussion. And if you aren't already, please do follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We need to keep this conversation going, and I hope you'll join us next time. Ambassador, an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Elena, Bogdana, Jeremy. Thanks a lot for hosting me today.
All right.
We look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Yes.
Thanks so much.